The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, John Michael McGrath and yours truly do a deep dive into the federal leaders debate in a special Monday edition of On Pauli. Then, as the world mourns the death of Pope Francis, we revisit our conversation on the pontiff's legacy. That's ahead on the agenda. Okay, partner, first of all, a little sugar there.
Reunited and it feels so good.
Are you peaches or am I herb?
I'm
Wasn't that
not
peaches and
even
herb? Anyway, number one, first of all, where's your Leaf jersey? Come on, man.
I'm not even sure I own one.
John, Michael, we really need to do something about you. I am just shocked and appalled. You do know what happened in the city last night, right?
Yes, I am aware that the Leafs won, was it 6-2?
Okay, not bad. We're off to a pretty good start.
I do pay attention to the news somewhat.
Okay, so anyway, I brought this in for you. I actually wanted to give you this. I got this at the game last night. John Michael, you need to bring the passion. You need to bring the passion that unites all of Leafs Nation. Woohoo! Because last night was just great. I got to tip, my voice is just really bad today, so you may have to carry the load here a bit today. But I'll tell you something. You understand the team has been cursed since 1967, right? Has not won a Stanley Cup?
Yes, I do understand that,
okay.
Yes.
So here's the thing. I have to be scrupulously neutral when it comes to politics, when it comes to issues, when it comes to covering everything on this program. In sports, I'm not objective, okay? I'm sorry. I've been a Leaf fan. I went to my first Leaf game. How long ago was it? It was almost 60 years ago that I went to my first Leaf game. So I'm sorry. I know it's the Battle of Ontario. I know we have 2 NHL teams in this province. But I'm sorry. Go Leafs, go. I'm sorry. There, I've said it. All right. There we go. Let's just continue by saying if you are watching us on television, no, you are not on the wrong night. We are usually on Friday nights on TVO on television. This week, however, because of the leaders' debate, was
Thursday night.
Last Thursday. Yes. Thank you for the reminder. So our show last Friday, Good Friday, we did it all about the return of the legislature at Queen's Park.
Yes.
So today this is our first chance to talk about the leaders debate. So we will.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am not sporting Leafs wear, but I am wearing a little popcorn pattern here because we're going to talk about a bit of a show. And
okay. I see the method.
I did not, in fact, make myself popcorn as I watched the leaders debate, but that's the vibe I'm going for.
Okay, I've got the method to your madness now. Now okay, before we go talk about the leaders debate, when we last gathered, and I was in Montreal and you were in Toronto, I wore a T-shirt with former Premier Oliver Mowat on it because over the weekend it was the 122nd anniversary of Mowat's death. He was our third Premier, our longest serving Premier, nearly 24 years. And so he's buried a half an hour from here, a half an hour walk from this studio. So Sheldon, you want to put this picture up here? I went down to Mount Pleasant Cemetery, just south of here, and I wore his T-shirt that I wore on the On Pauli podcast last week, and there's his headstone in the background, very big headstone, and there's lots of stuff on there. Boy, the guy's accomplished. He did a lot of stuff,
Yes.
Did a lot of stuff, and it's all there on the headstone, and, I just felt on the anniversary of his death, which was Saturday, would be a good idea to go down and visit him, so I did.
Very nicely done, sir.
Yeah, there we go. And what else do we want to do?
Right. Before we head to issue 1, we do have a small piece of election news. We had early voting over the long weekend, and according to Elections Canada, Friday set a new record for advanced polling.
Wow.
2 million votes in one day.
Okay.
For context, the 2021 election saw 5.8 million turnout for all of the advanced polling. So we don't know yet, obviously, whether we are heading towards a very high turnout election federally, but we haven't seen a lot of high turnout elections provincially in the last few cycles. So, fingers crossed. That is, again, not allowed to be overtly partisan, but we're allowed to cheer for high turnout.
We can cheer for democracy, man. When more people are engaged in democracy, I think it's a good thing. So
absolutely.
That's great.
And
that's
great. I have seen reports that those lineups continued like Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. We'll probably, maybe later today, we'll get an estimate from Elections Canada about what the total early turnout is. But fingers crossed.
Good stuff. Shall we talk debates?
Let's go to our one and only issue.
There we go. Off to issue 1. 4 party leaders gathered in Montreal last Thursday night for the English language leaders debate. And the first thing we need to point out is this is a television experience. JMM, you watched it on television. I had a somewhat different view.
Yes.
So I'm going to start with you. What were your impressions of the leaders' debate as a television event?
I really liked it. Not just saying that because of your participation, but it was a substantive debate, for serious people talking about serious issues seriously. There were occasional moments where partisanship overcame those substantial points that people were making, but I'm not scandalized by partisanship in politics, right? I have to make a slight confession in that, there's been some busy stuff happening provincially, and I have not paid perhaps as close attention to federal politics as I should have for what is an election campaign. But it's like, we're the On Poly podcast. We're not the Can Poly podcast. So for starters, this was, I think, the longest, I'm quite sure this was the longest I had seen Mark Carney speak in a single sitting. I've paid attention to some of his press conferences, that kind of thing, but not like a 2-hour stretch like this. Obviously, I'm more familiar with the other leaders. They've had prior runs, and Jagmeet Singh, of course, was an MPP, so I remember him from Queen's Park as well. Mercifully few moments where things devolved into that crosstalk where everybody's yelling at each other and you can't understand a single word. Not great for voters. Also, to your point, not great TV.
Yep.
If I had a hot take, I would say I think that having Monsieur Blanchet on the stage was, I think he may have been solely responsible for the mentions of provincial affairs in the entire debate. And it's a federal debate. Of course, federal politics are going to take center stage. But both Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre are making promises that will require substantial provincial consent. I mean, when you talk about expanding resource exports, Monsieur Poilievre has talked about needing to build a Atlantic pipeline, which is going to have to go through Quebec, right? That is going to require provincial consent. So I liked Blanchet's periodic reminder that hey, no, the provinces are here, they still exist, and of course he is insisting on one province very particularly yes. And its interests.
Well, you know what he was doing? He was channeling his inner Oliver Mowat, because Mowat was
yes.
the first premier to really champion provincial rights and
yes.
used to get on Sir Johnny MacDonald's nerves all the time. So that's what I thought was happening. It's just that Monsieur Blanchet was channeling his inner Oliver Mowat. What do you think the odds are on that?
I suspect if you put that to him, he might disagree. But okay. In the context of this podcast, I think we can agree to that.
Thank you. Okay.
I did like a particular exchange between, it was Blanchet talking about provincial affairs, and he and Mark Carney got into it a little bit, and we'll have that clip here, I believe.
You are telling fairy tales. Clean oil and gas is a fairy tale. Large-scale carbon sequestration, sorry, I'm French, is a fairy tale. It does not exist.
I was born in Fort Smith in the Northwest Territories, just north of what the oil sands became. When I was born and when I was growing up in Edmonton, early days, it was a fairy tale, quote unquote. But you know what happened? Canadian ingenuity, Canadian engineers, Canadian governments, both the federal government and the Alberta government got together and created.
So yeah, that's an example of the kinds of exchange that I particularly enjoyed in that debate. I also just want to add very quickly that I liked the touch of having the shot clocks up, where you could see how much time each leader had gotten. I think particularly partisan viewers are regularly will just naturally complain about their guy is not getting as much time to respond or whatever. And I liked that little addition in the name of transparency of having everybody's times up. Yeah, it was a nice addition.
Blanchet had a funny line about that. Remember once he looked up at the wall and he said, "I see that Mr. Carney has much more time spoken than me, so I'm going to give a longer answer here." And at that moment, I had the executive producer of the debate, Laura Chatterjee, say in my ear, "It's okay, let him go," because he was low on time at that moment. So
yes,
there we go.
So I mean, the same question back to you. I mean, obviously different perspective, but as you were moderating it, what was your impression?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, it's a very different impression when you're sitting a few feet away from them and you're not watching it on television. So I did get asked a lot, well, what do you think? Who do you think won? And, that was my 9th leaders debate, and I'm always the worst person to ask because you can't tell. Yeah. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but you can't tell. Yeah. You got to remember, I got people talking in my ear. I'm keeping an eye on the clock. I got an eye on what my next question's supposed to be. I'm listening, sort of, if there's an obvious follow-up that needs asking during the open forum part, I will ask that. You're juggling so many things in that moment that you're really not sort of paying attention on who's winning on points or who's getting the. I mean, if there's a apropos of WWE, if there's a SmackDown moment, you'll notice that. But otherwise, not really. It was hard for me to tell.
Yeah, no, I've done the AMO Ministers Forums a few times, which is substantially lower tension, lower stakes than a debate forum, and it's really extraordinary how easy it is to, even in something like that, where just all I have to do is remember which microphone got the last opportunity to talk, and it's very easy to lose track if you're not really actively paying attention to it. So yeah, I totally get the not being able to tell what it looks like on TV at home, right?
Very much.
What did you think of the format?
I like the format. Now, I didn't have a say in the format. The format was presented to me, but I liked it. I like the fact that we had sort of one-on-one question opportunities to start each of the 5 themes, and then the respondents got a minute to answer, which is almost twice as long as you get when you're in the House of Commons. Yes. So, I mean, again, I was going for depth in that debate. I wanted us to have longer, fewer bells and whistles. I wanted fewer tape pieces. I wanted to leave the studio less. I wanted to keep it in the studio. So one-on-one questions I liked, followed by much longer times, opportunities for open discussion after that. So to me, the format, there's no such thing as a perfect format.
No.
But that's about as close, I think, as you can get to it.
Yeah, I think it worked really well in terms of, it's funny to say it, but like the politicians are not really there to debate. They are there to present their message, which is after 3 or 4 weeks of campaigning, it's whittled down to, sound bites, and they want to get their sound bites on TV in front of the audience. And we call them debates, but like they're almost not even there really to interact with each other as much. And so I thought that there's a constant urge to try and force the leaders to do something that they kind of don't want to do.
Exactly.
And I thought that the combination of those rapid fire questions sort of gave them what they want to do. They want to give those quick answers. And then when you opened it up into the general debate, I thought you got into more substance than you might have if they had felt like they had to shoehorn all of their sound bites into the open debate part.
Agreed. I mean, that's the hope. And just to give people a sense of this thing, in past debates that I've done, usually the open forum segment among all the leaders might be 6 or 7 minutes long. This time I think it was 12, 13, 14 minutes long, depending on which theme it was. So if the idea was try to spend as much time in the studio debating amongst the 4 of them, or discussing things amongst the 4 of them, and making sure we had the time to do that, I think this format allowed for that.
We've mentioned the time a bunch. I did enjoy Mark Carney saying to you, you have a tell when he was going over time.
Well, okay. So I mentioned a second ago, one of my eyes is obviously on my question sheet. The other is on the watch to make sure everybody's getting roughly equal time. And when Mr. Carney would sort of, and they could see the clocks. I'm not sure why he said that, because they could see the clocks in front of them. They knew when the clock was counting down. But I'd be listening to him, and then I'd look over here like this to see what the clock was, and he seemed to think that was a tell. And I said back to him, I said, it's not a tell. It's just me looking at the clock running out and saying, I got to cut you off. Anyway, I guess that was one of a few lighthearted moments during the course of the thing.
Yeah. Now, you did have to do a big pivot even before the debate had started, because the day before, the Debates Commission announced that the Green Party would not be participating in the debates. What did you make of that?
Well, okay, first of all, you're right. We had to, and I think it was a lot harder for the French language debate, because obviously they are pulling a podium out, going from 5 to 4, and they are rewriting questions on the day to take the Green Party questions out and replace them with something else. We at least had 24 hours to make that happen. They had to do that really quickly. Yeah. Look, that was a decision made by the Debate Commission. The Debate Commission was this sort of government-created commission who essentially makes the rules for the thing. Who can participate, who's going to do it, who's going to do the debate. In this case, they picked CBC to do the debate. And, it's pretty simple math here. There are 3 criteria for participation. You got to meet 2 of the criteria or you don't get to participate. Do you have elected MPs in the House? Well, the Greens did, yes. Are you polling at 6% nationally? No, they were not. Have you nominated candidates in 90% of the ridings in the country? It turns out, no, they had not. You need to have two of those three things. The Greens, as it turns out, only had one of those three things. And so they got disinvited at the last minute. A lot of people ask me, why was the Bloc there? They're only running candidates in one province. True, but do they have elected MPs? Yes. Are they polling at 6%? Yes, 6% nationally. Do they have nominated candidates in 90% of the ridings? No, but they have two of the three, and that's what you need.
Yeah.
And the Greens didn't have it, and that's why they were out. They're only polling, 2 or 3% nationally right now, which is just, it's not adequate to entitle yourself to a spot on the debate stage.
Well,
apparently.
and they had pulled, they'd made a strategic decision to pull some candidates out of ridings.
Yes.
There's also some debate that I've seen about how much of this was deliberate, because in some cases they've just not found people willing to be nominated as candidates in some ridings. But it's not that they missed that particular bar by a little. Mm-hmm. They missed it by quite a bit.
They did.
And
now the debate commission probably should have known that before the day of the debate.
Yes.
I mean, that's a little...
Yeah, the deadline for nominating candidates was well behind us.
Correct.
So yeah, it may have been the correct decision to make, but making it at the time they did was disruptive.
Disruptive, to say the least. Yes, indeed. Now, want to know what happened before the debate began?
Yes, I would like to hear.
Okay. Our debate started at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. They bring the four leaders in on stage about 6 minutes ahead of time, because you got to take a picture of the four of them before the debate begins, and then they threw me in there, and we had a 5-shot as well. They were not permitted to bring notes, right? No cheat notes allowed to be brought in. So it's very interesting. I wondered what they were going to do with the sort of 4 minutes between when they finished taking the photos and they got behind their podiums. What do you do for those 4 minutes? As it turns out, we gave them a pen and a pad, and they were all scribbling notes furiously. And I guess it's because they were told, all right, you can't bring notes out there, so for a closing statement, here are the 3 or 4 points you got to make. And when they went out there, I imagine what they were doing is writing down their big talking points that they wanted to say for their closing statements. That was very different from the last federal leaders debate I did, which was 2011, because I think at that time they were allowed to have notes. And as a result, when they brought everybody out there at about 5 or 6 minutes to the top of the clock, everybody just sort of stood around looking around and didn't know what to do with their time. And they had this big ominous music playing on the set the whole time, which was driving everybody crazy. And I finally just said, can you turn the damn music off? You're making everybody crazy out here with this music. And they sort of sat there twiddling their thumbs for 6 minutes, waiting for the top of the clock to come. So I'm glad we didn't have to do that this time.
Yeah.
They actually used the time constructively, and then we were off to the races.
So, I mean, in the French debate, your colleague Patrice Roy made the decision to actually kill Jagmeet Singh's microphone.
Yes.
Because Mr. Singh kept interrupting, would insert himself into the debate.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Singh was also pretty chippy in the English language debate. Did you think about cutting his mic too?
I actually did not. I didn't think. Look, you have to make a judgment call throughout these things, right? There's a very fine line between sort of intervening, interjecting, being sparky, and being completely disruptive and getting to the point where nobody can hear anything anymore. And these are judgment calls. During the French debate, Patrice obviously had decided that Mr. Singh was, for lack of a better expression, out of control and really bringing the thing down. And so he gave him 3 chances. He said, Monsieur Singh, 1. Monsieur Singh, 2. Monsieur Singh, 3. He wouldn't stop talking, so he cut his mic. I never had that situation in the debate that I moderated, so I didn't feel a need to do so. He definitely interrupted a lot. He was very chippy. I got JMM to the extent I got emails afterwards. The one point that was made more than any other by the people who emailed me, and I got hundreds of emails after it was over, was Jagmeet Singh did not do himself any good by interrupting as much as he did. People just thought it was rude. It was too much. I know he wanted to look aggressive. I know he wanted to look like he was in it. let's face it, he's fighting for his political life out there because,
Yes.
we can all read the polls, right?
Yes.
So we know what he's up against, but I never thought it rose to the level where I had to kill his mic.
No, and it's such a tough call to make in those situations because, as you say, on the one hand, maybe he's being disruptive, and you can just make this point generically. Whenever these kinds of things happen, what is your obligation as a moderator? I mean, is it to cut that kind of behavior down in the interest of the debate, or is it in fact to show voters that kind of behavior? Clearly, based on your emails, some people reacted poorly to Mr. Singh's performance, and if it doesn't help their numbers in the polls, I think certainly the records of this campaign, people are going to look back and say, maybe he wasn't going into the debate holding a winning hand exactly, but didn't do himself any favors either. Now, this is also live TV, and what people at home may not necessarily grasp is that you really are on a hard clock, and there's either you hit that mark or you don't. Did you have to drop any questions for time?
Well, we certainly thought we would have to, because in these things, invariably somebody goes overtime or something goes wrong or something happens whereby you get off schedule. In fact, no, we didn't have to drop a thing. We had 5 themes. We then had that leader's choice where each leader could ask any other leader a question. And then we got a last question in which was designed to sort of show a more human side of the leaders, in which I asked them all, any regrets? What do you regret about the campaign? So we got all the Q&As, all the 5 themes, the open debates, the leader's choice, the question about regrets, and then even beyond that, the producers built in, I think, 30 to 60 seconds of pad in, just in case anything goes long for whatever reason. And you assume that 30 or 60 seconds will get eaten up at some point during the debate, and then we just sign off. For whatever reason, everything went according to Hoyle. We stayed right on time. In fact, some of the leaders didn't use all of the time allotted to them in their minute-long answers. So we actually came up light, which never happens, I can tell you. And they said in my earpiece, take your time reading the closing. We're light here. And I inferred from that I could do a little vamping, and so I did. During the course of my research, I found out that Yves-François Blanchet's birthday was the night before. So I made a little quip about the fact that he celebrated his 60th birthday on the debate stage the day before. And I saw that put the leaders in, they smiled. It put them in a bit of a good mood, and they wished him happy birthday and so on. And then, I guess I had a little more time, and I thought, I got to do one more thing. I remembered the night before, Patrice Roy signed off by pointing out that the debate had to be moved because of the Montreal Canadiens game, because it was a big game, and the playoffs were at stake, and then he gave a whole Go Habs Go at the end there, right? And I thought to myself, I'm not letting him get away with that. So I said something like, for the record, let's point out we did not have to move the time of this debate. And then I got my haughty Maple Leaf hat on, and I said, because the Leafs clinched their division already this week, and we didn't have to move the debate because they did their job already. And I said, if Patrice can mention the Habs, then darn it, I'm going to mention the Leafs. And then in the interest of national unity, I said, well, Go Habs Go anyway. What the heck?
Shall we wrap
Let's
up?
move along. With that, let's get off to your column, my column. Okay, time now for that regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the columns we wrote for TVO.org over the past week. What you got for us?
Now, you worked over the weekend and I did not, so I haven't actually published anything since last Friday. But I did want to flag something from earlier in the month because I don't want people to miss it. The Financial Accountability Office, one of our favorite government offices or legislative offices, put out a report on provincial spending trends since 1990. And it's a really interesting report if you want to sort of step back and take a big picture look at how provincial spending has changed in the last 35 years or so. It covers governments of all 3 parties, right? The Ray NDP government, Mike Harris Tories, McGuinty and Wynne Liberals, and now, of course, the Doug Ford Tories. And I will say that I think it's only a slight exaggeration to say that the narrative of provincial spending in the last 35 years is basically the changes brought in by Mike Harris and then the reactions to those changes. The Harris government brought spending way down, and then that became unpopular by 2003, and the Liberals then resumed spending. But in a lot of ways, since losing the 2018 election, the Liberals, I think, had that reputation of being big spending governments, right? And one of the most common criticisms of Kathleen Wynne and her time in power was that they went too far to the left. And we can argue about that another time, but one thing that surprised me from this FAO report was that the Ontario government did not get back to the same sort of level of spending per person that it had in the early 1990s until 2009. Right? We had this big drop in spending, and then it only started to come back up, and it only really reached the same level in 2009. Now, then I guess to the criticism of the Liberals is that it did in fact keep increasing, but the things that we spend money on have changed, right? We spend a lot more on healthcare than we used to, and we also spend more on education. Education grew more under the Liberals than it has under Tory governments. I don't think anybody will be shocked to discover that, but I won't go over the rest of the entire report, but I just found it. I mean, it's a media report, lots of fun charts, lots of statistics to go through. But if you are curious about the big picture of how the government spends and what it spends it on, I would urge our audience to go check it out.
Cool.
How about you?
Well, I had a 6-hour train ride home from Montreal after the debate was over, so guess what I did on the train?
Did you write something?
I wrote a column, yes indeed. I wrote a column about what you didn't see after the leaders' debate was over. And I wanted to write that column because I got a lot of emails Thursday night after the debate, because they did not, as soon as the debate was over, apparently the cameras lingered on the stage.
Yes.
And people could see that I was engaged with Jagmeet Singh on what looked like a fairly dramatic and intense conversation. And people said, was he giving you hell, or what was going on there? And so I thought, one of the reasons I want to write this column is to explain what in fact did happen on that stage. And the answer is no. Jagmeet Singh was not giving me HE double hockey sticks for anything. In fact, what he said to me, and I go into more detail in the column about this, what he said was, I'm looking up at the wall right now, I'm looking at the clocks, and I got the least amount of speaking time of any of the 4 leaders, but I'm okay with it. He says, I got a chance to make my points. I think I did well. I got a chance to talk a lot about healthcare, which I wanted to do, he said, which he didn't necessarily get to do the night before. So he looked at me and he said, so it's fine. It's all good. It was a good debate. Okay, good. I was glad to hear that. Out of the corner of my eye, as I was talking to Jagmeet Singh, I did see a moment where Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre were shaking hands. And I found that most interesting. And I'll tell you, the day before, we had a production meeting among the debate staff at CBC, and we said, if we're lingering on the stage after the debate is over, make sure you got a camera on Poilievre and Carney, because, who knows what they're going to do. Right. They might get into a fight after it's over because of something that happened in the debate. Yeah. They might totally snub each other and walk in opposite directions. Yeah. We need to know what happened. And what happened is, maybe it was the most iconic moment of the debate, in fact, ironically, after it's over, they had a handshake and a short conversation.
Nice.
And by all accounts, it looked very civil. Yeah. It looked like it was a nice conversation. So I'm glad that happened. It was a wonderful moment of civility after an intense debate, and it was a great example of how our debates can be very different from, say, presidential debates in the United States, which in an era of Trump are really, not good. Some of them are truly awful.
Yes.
And then the last thing that happened was I had a little conversation with Pierre Poilievre. And he came up to me and he said, I've been in this room with you for 2 hours now, and I haven't got a clue who you're going to vote for. And I said, good. That's a good sign. He thought it was a very well-run debate. They all said that afterwards, which was nice because, apropos of the column I wrote last week, the one thing you don't want is your name in the papers the next day because everybody thinks you botched it and put your thumb on the scale for somebody.
Yeah.
And I had 4 leaders after the debate was over who said, you didn't put your thumb on the scale for anybody. It was fairly done. So I'm glad about that. Now, I took 2 days before I went on Twitter, X, before seeing what many members of the general public thought, and they ranged from, you did such an awful job, you should be put up against the wall and shot, to you should die of cancer, to
Monday on Twitter.
Exactly. Just another day on Twitter to, the worst moderating effort I've ever seen in the history of leaders' debates. So, okay. There was not unanimity on the kind of job I did, but, what do you say? I did the best I could.
Yes. All right. With that, let's go to the mailbag.
If you've got a burning question or insightful comment, we always like hearing from you at onpolitics@tvo.org. JMM, what's this week's?
So we've already talked a bit about leaders speaking to one another after the debate. Here is a question on that moment from Drake Morin in Ottawa. Dear Steve and JMM, first, congratulations on a debate well moderated. Mr. Paikin, I thought it was an engaging and substantive debate with a good format. Steve, you have decried the lack of civility in our modern politics. After the debate, it was nice to see main rivals Pierre Poilievre and Carney speaking amiably to each other and just generally looking like respectful, kind Canadians. How can we encourage more of this civility in our politics and protect against more extreme American-style political impulses? Sincerely, Drake Morin in Ottawa.
Drake, wonderful question, and I think the answer is we just don't let up off the accelerator, right? We keep our foot on the gas. We keep reminding, and viewers sent hundreds of emails to me on this subject alone, Don't let them be miserable with each other. Don't let them all shout at each other. Yeah. We have to have civility. We want a good, energetic, intense debate, but they've got to be civil with one another. We don't want a screaming match. And I think as long as we keep reminding them that that's what we expect. Yeah. We don't want Trumpism in our debates in Canada. You can go at each other hammer and tongue, but at the end of the day, you've got to be civil with one another. If we don't let up on that, I think we have a better shot of ensuring that it happens.
And we have a second letter from Alan Polk in London, Ontario, who writes, congratulations, Steve, on your moderating the federal leaders debate. For the most part, the participants were intelligible and had enough time to get their points across. I would appreciate if you and JMM would address the issue of the planned use of the notwithstanding clause by the federal government if the Conservatives win the election, and what it means by simply having a political party platform include a policy of using it. I believe the federal government should never be using the notwithstanding clause to set aside charter rights across the entire federation. This speaks to either laziness, the lack of imagination or skill on how to craft a good law, or contempt for the charter itself. I would appreciate your thoughts on this. Best regards, Alan.
Well, Alan, two schools of thought on this, obviously. There are some who believe, and I remember talking to former Premier Bill Davis about this, who was sort of one of the latter-day fathers of Confederation, who was there at the table in 1982 when the notwithstanding clause was put in the charter. That was the thing that broke through the logjam, right? There was a logjam until then. So the notwithstanding clause was put in there. Notwithstanding all of these rights you have, governments are allowed for a 5-year period of time to set these rights aside if, in their wisdom, they decide it's in the interests of society to do so. And Mr. Davis was of the view that this was a safety valve for provincial parliaments when they felt it was necessary, but it should be extraordinarily rarely used. And, of course, in the 2004 leaders debate, Paul Martin, who was prime minister at the time, said, we don't think the federal government should ever use this notwithstanding clause. There are others, and Pierre Poilievre is obviously one of them, who say, and Doug Ford's another one of them as well, who say the notwithstanding clause is in the charter. They wouldn't have put it in there if they didn't expect you to use it every now and then. And we can, honorable people can disagree about the circumstances under which to use it. So I'm not going to take a position on it, but those are the two sides. What do you say?
Well, I think, one of the big questions we have regarding not just our Constitution, but I look to the South in the U.S. And I think the notwithstanding clause is, it's something in the text of our Constitution that says that constitutional interpretation is not up to judges alone, right? It says that our elected politicians do have a role in examining the decisions made by the Supreme Court and disagreeing with them. And obviously, the notwithstanding clause is time limited. I don't think that necessarily means that every use of the notwithstanding clause is right or correct. It's possible for me to sort of imagine speculatively one that I might agree with, but I don't think I've seen one in actual practice that I thought was necessarily worthwhile. And of course, we just had a decision here in Ontario where the Ford government used the notwithstanding clause, and the Supreme Court actually struck that down, saying that they used it in a part of the charter that was not permissible. So I don't think this debate is going away, even if Mr. Poilievre does not form government. I think at the moment, the conservative movement in this country has a very deep belief that on criminal law in particular, that the Supreme Court needs to be argued with, let me put it that way, and that they want to use the notwithstanding clause to do that. That said, we also saw what Mark Carney believes. He said it on the debate stage, where he said, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms exists to protect Canadians from people like us on the stage, indicating himself and the other leaders, politicians who might use their power to override fundamental rights. So
it sounds like he's saying there are no circumstances under which I'd use it because it could be the thin edge of the wedge.
That's certainly how I took it, yeah.
Yeah. Why don't you give the email address and let's get out of here.
Absolutely. Again, if you'd like to ask about content on the show, please email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the On Poly podcast for this Monday, April 21st, 2025.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Until this Friday, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
After weeks of health struggles, news today that Pope Francis has died at the age of 88. As Catholics around the world mourn his passing, here's a conversation from last month reflecting on the pontiff's legacy and what stands next for the faith. Let's start with some background about the man who has been the Pope for the past 12 years. What do we need to know about that?
Well, first, a number of firsts, actually, Steve. He is the first Latin American pontiff we've had. He's from Argentina, as you know. His background, his parents were Italian immigrants, but he is very much a figure of the global South. But he's a first in several other categories as well, by which I mean he's the first member of the papacy ever to be a member of the Society of Jesus, so he's a Jesuit. He's the first actually to take the name Francis, which he took from Francesco di Bernardone, who, of course, Francis of Assisi, right? And he is also the first to, in quite a while, to live outside the Apostolic Palace, which is the traditional residence of the Pope, and moved into basically an apartment complex adjacent to the Basilica, but quite close to the Apostolic Palace, which was illustrative and remains illustrative of his commitment to simplifying the papacy in style, in appearance, and in reality.
Did people find that odd?
They find it both attractive and discomforting. They find it attractive in the sense, here's a Pope who's committed to a radical simplicity of style. We haven't had a Pope like this for a very long time. To a degree, John the 23rd from 1958 to 1963 introduced many reforms into the church, but he was still very much a product of the old tradition. Francis, who was never at the council, first Pope we've had who was not in any way at the council, is very much a Pope of the council. And as a consequence, he's attempted to simplify the trappings of the papacy. Others find that disturbing because they love the color and the splendor and the panoply and the epic nature of the papacy, convinced that it's been inalterable over the centuries since the time of Jesus. But that, of course, is entirely ahistorical. What we have now is much more a product of the Renaissance than it is of the early church. So he's a man who's brought a refreshing and radical simplicity to the office of Peter.
Let me follow up with you on that, Emma Anderson, which is to say the notion that he's the first Jesuit, the first non-European to become Pope. Did all of the, in some respects, I'm asking you to sum up the views of more than 1 billion Catholics here, but how intriguing or neat do you think Catholics found those two aspects of his background?
Well, I still remember when he was first introduced back in 2013, and he came up onto the balcony, and he was dressed, of course, all in white, but he didn't have a really bejeweled pectoral cross, and he simply said, "Buona sera," good evening. And his glasses reminded me of those of my father, very simple, maybe cheap even. He wasn't wearing any of the red regalia, and he quickly moved past the part where normally the Pope blesses and prays for the crowd, opting instead to have the crowd bless and pray for him, which I think right away sort of sent this signal that this was going to be a different kind of pope. That and his title, Pope Francis, not Pope Francis I, but just Pope Francis, bringing to mind, of course, not just one, but two heroes. The first being Francis of Assisi, as Michael mentioned, with those associated ethics that surround St. Francis, concern for the environment, nature, and also for the poor. And Pope Francis has done a wonderful job of linking those two together, really making a strong argument that our sins, collective sins against the environment and nature, also end up hurting the most vulnerable people in the world as well.
And in terms of what makes him very different or distinctive from his predecessors, Michael gave us a bit of a list. What would you add to the list?
I would say the emphasis on simplicity definitely has this kind of Franciscan overtone. But to me, the most remarkable thing about Pope Francis's papacy has been really almost a kind of slow redefinition of really what sin means. Sin, I think, for Pope Francis is something that is more structural, institutional, and human rather than Catholic particularly. If we look at the evolution of the papacy and their sort of personal hobby horses of John the 23rd, Paul the Sixth, then moving into John Paul I, II, and then Benedict, we can see that for most of those after John the 23rd, there was an emphasis really on the definition of individual sexual sins like homosexuality, like abortion, like artificial birth control, those sorts of things. Whereas with Pope Francis, we've really got a radical break with that. He is asking and holding a mirror up, not just to Catholics, but to all of humanity. What are you doing to make the world worse? And what could you do to make the world better? And again, this emphasis on the environment and how all of us are causing destruction. All of us are complicit in the destruction of the planet. All of us are turning our back on our most vulnerable brothers and sisters. These are messages that are new and different, really, since the time of Pope John the 23rd.
Okay, Michael, let me pick up on that with you. If a pope is fortunate, he is remembered for a particular string of reforms or something. What's on the list for this pope in terms of notable reforms that you think he'll be remembered for forever?
I think there are a number of them, actually, Steve, and the most important is the notion of synodality. This is a concept that he actually drew from in terms of Eastern Orthodoxy, the Church of England, and other bodies that have had various forms of synod governance. But he took the term and he applied it differently in the context of the Catholic history of synods. Now, without getting too technical about this, what it means, in effect, is he has created a culture of deep listening, reverencing the other, punctuating our arguments and polemics with moments of blessed and curative silence rather than screaming at each other. Now, he wanted to model that way, it's sometimes called conversations in the spirit, by institutionalizing it. And so he had two sessions on synodality itself. This seems, for some, an archaic thing, maybe an amusement for the Pope, really of no long-term structural potential change, but it is. He's changing the face of the church, how to be church, how to be a member of the church, how to speak freely and to listen attentively. That kind of reform, changing the culture of being a Catholic, is an enormous part of the Bergoglio legacy, continues to be part of that.
Bergoglio's his real name.
That's right, Bergoglio, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, that Francis, Papa Bergoglio.
He has had, Emma, a dramatic and historic connection to Canada in as much as nearly 3 years ago, he went to Alberta to deliver an apology to residential school victims there. We're going to show a brief clip of that, and then I'm going to come back and get your take on that. Sheldon, if you would.
Today, I am here in this land that, along with its ancient memories, preserves the scars of still open wounds. I am here because the first step of my penitential pilgrimage among you is that of again asking forgiveness, of telling you once more that I am deeply sorry.
Emma, what was the significance of those words to that church?
Well, it was historic, and this is something that Canadians, particularly Indigenous Canadians, have been waiting for a very long time. Throughout much of Francis's papacy, it didn't look like it was going to happen. And then in 2022, the Pope came, and he came despite mobility issues that had him largely in a wheelchair for most of his visit. And he linked his visit with what I thought was quite a good idea, really under the aegis of Saint Anne, the grandmother of Jesus, a saint who has often been one of the most popular in Indigenous Catholic circles because of the fact that she's an elder, because of the fact that she's a grandmother. She's a relatable and healing figure. And she also speaks to that need for healing of extended Indigenous families and intergenerational trauma from residential schools. His apologies were fulsome. They seemed heartfelt. They were repeated. And in each of the places that he visited, he linked this kind of message of really seeking forgiveness from Indigenous people for the historical wrongs, including the arrogance of thinking that the Catholic Church could or should try to change the culture, language, and particularly the spirituality of Canada's Indigenous people.
Foreign affairs. John Paul II is perhaps best known as the Pope who had the most significant influence on foreign affairs in the world, but this Pope has weighed in as well. Ukraine. Here's what he had to say about ending the war. Sheldon, a clip if you would.
Quella parola negoziare è una parola coraggiosa. Quando tu vedi che sei sconfitto, che la cosa non va, avere il coraggio di negoziare. Ti vergogna, ma te continui così, quanti morti hai poi? E finirà peggio ancora. Negoziare in tempo, cercare qualche paese che faccia da mediatore.
Well, I guess America's not going to be that mediator right now. That was an interview, incidentally, from last year. And then just 2 days ago from the hospital, he posted this. He said, I pray for you too. I pray above all for peace. From here, war appears even more absurd. Let us pray for martyred Ukraine, Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Myanmar, Sudan, and Kivu. Okay, let's get into this now. Emma, why do you think it was important for him to weigh in on the multiple crises and upheavals that are happening in foreign affairs today?
I think this speaks to the fact that this is a different kind of Pope and that he puts his pastoral priorities first. You were just talking, Michael, so well about the Pope's capacity for compassion and empathy. And I think we really see this in his advocacy for those suffering under tyranny, suffering under war, suffering under poverty, suffering under exclusion. And I also think that the Pope is best when he speaks from his heart and often speaks off the cuff and often then has people have to try to walk back what he's saying. Some of the most famous comments of his papacy were made in the air when he was talking to reporters flying from one place to the other. Perhaps one of the most famous comments of his entire 12 years was, who am I to judge on the issue of kind, open-hearted homosexuals. He's like, who am I to judge that they're any better or worse Catholics than I am myself? So once again, we get this kind of sense of wanting to be with, advocate for, and have a solidarity with those who are in the worst places. Just like Michael was saying, one of the first trips he made was to stand side by side with migrants who had barely survived their hellish ordeal in flight from places war-torn, with no economic opportunities, seeking a better life. And I think that's what he's trying to do as he daily, even from his hospital bed, communicates with parish priests in Gaza, for example.
Michael, where would you put his impact on world affairs, say, compared to John Paul II?
Well, you were right to say that John Paul II was very politically oriented. He was, and he didn't apologize for it, and his initiatives were often epic and sometimes quite revolutionary. With Francis, I think they're both more sustained, less dramatic, and persistent. We've had an instance recently at the beginning of the Jubilee year where, along with Cardinal O'Malley of the recently retired Archbishop of Boston, he worked to have released 536 Cuban prisoners. And he's done this several times before with Barack Obama. He negotiated a new relationship between the United States and Cuba, as you know, which has been hostile for decades. He's also been involved in other discussions in other parts of the world. You've got to remember, the Vatican is quite a complex institution with representation at some 180 countries. It has nunciatures or papal embassies in all these countries. And he can also access international religious organizations, religious orders and whatnot, to provide information to help him function with his Secretary of State, Cardinal Parolin, and his Secretary for Relations with States, Paul Gallagher. He's able to negotiate in ways that aren't so easy for standard sovereignties. I'll end by saying this. It does seem to me that in a time in which governments are becoming increasingly and determinedly self-isolationist, where the old order of multilateralism is beginning to crumble, when we have a new and threatening narcissism among nations, the role of the papacy as a mediating power has never been greater. And as you saw with the quotation with regard to Ukraine, but also his daily phone calls to a parish that's besieged in Gaza. He doesn't go a night, with the exception of his illness right now, without phoning them. His involvement with other areas and jurisdictions under great international stress. He's always attempted to find ways of mediating. So he's dispatched ambassadors, Vatican delegates and whatnot, when he can't go himself. It's not without controversy. He's got himself into some difficulty with the Ukrainian community, the diaspora, that feel that his emphasis on negotiation is establishing a kind of moral equivalence between the two powers, which in fact doesn't obtain. And of course, his commitment to a new negotiation or concordat or renewal with Beijing has created a lot of anxiety amongst diaspora Catholics in Hong Kong or abroad who feel that he doesn't really read the Beijing government right. But it's his commitment to dialogue, Steve, that's important. He talks about this in an earlier work of Fratelli Tutti. He talks about the importance of dialogue and negotiation with all. That's his long commitment. Maybe he's an idealist, maybe he's a romantic, but he's committed to dialogue and negotiation as the only way out of complex situations.
Emma, and again, admittedly, we're in the realm of speculation here, but what do we know about the direction in which the majority of cardinals may be leaning in terms of how doctrinaire, how liberal, etc., they want the next pope to be?
Well, the wonderful thing about this is we can do a kind of a statistical analysis. So we've got 253 cardinals in the College of Cardinals, but not all of them are voting members. Only 140 are going to be able to cast their ballots. And just like Michael was saying, you have to be under the age of 80 to be able to cast a ballot. So some of our Canadian delegation, because we have 5 cardinals, will be able to participate, and some have recently aged out. So Cardinal Marc Ouellet, who was thought of as a possible pope or a papabili during the last 2 conclaves in 2005 and 2013. He will not be able to vote, although he probably will be participating behind the scenes. But others will. Thomas Collins, he's only 78. He'll be participating, as will Michael Cernsey. He was made a cardinal in 2019. We also have a brand new cardinal in Frank Leo of Toronto, who was only made a cardinal several months ago in December of 2024. And we have Gerald Lacroix, who's the youngest, aside from Leo, who's only 53. Lacroix is 67. So everyone except for Marc Ouellet will be able to vote in this conclave of the Canadian Cardinals. So then when we back up and say, of that 140, Pope Francis put in place 111 of this 140. We get a kind of a sense, perhaps, of where this conclave could go. But even with that, there is still room for doubt. Just because you were nominated or put in place by Francis does not necessarily mean that you're going to share all of his priorities and all of his spiritual ethos. Nevertheless, it does give him something of a leg up, I would say, in ensuring that his legacy continues in a more liberal direction.
And Michael, is it 50% plus one? Is that how you become the Pope?
No, it's back to 2/3.
2/3.
There have been several changes, and several changes even in the composition of the college. There was one time where the ceiling for the number of cardinals was 70, and now it's technically 120. But in fact, the popes exceeded all the time. But every country is going to play this game. And the bookmakers are already working in London, making decisions about who's going to get this or whatnot. And there are some names that have already surfaced. Cardinal Tagle, formerly of Manila, but in the Vatican structure for quite a number of years, obviously a Filipino. And the other one, Pietro Parolin, I referred to earlier, Secretary of State. But there is an old adage, Emma would know this, and I think you do as well, that a cardinal that enters a conclave, a pope, exits a cardinal. So the thing they most do is to dampen or tamper or damp down any speculation that they're seeking the position.
Emma Anderson, Michael Higgins, thanks so much for this absolutely fascinating conversation about what's next for the Catholic Church. Thanks to you both.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Monday, April 21st, 2025. Tomorrow on the program, we look at what the Trump administration's research funding cuts mean for the health of the Great Lakes. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.